The desert breathed heat like a living thing. Waves of gold shimmered over the dry horizon, bending the air until the distant buttes looked like ghosts rising out of the sand. The day was dying slow, and the wind had gone still, as if the world itself was holding its breath before nightfall. Elias Monroe rode along the fence line, reins loose in one hand, his hat tipped low against the sun. The old bay horse moved steady beneath him, each step crunching over gravel and cactus dust. Elias's shirt clung to his back, and sweat streaked the lines carved deep into his face. He'd been out since dawn, mending posts that the wind had snapped, chasing off coyotes that had been bold enough to test the edge of his land. The San Diablo Desert stretched for miles in every direction, too wide, too quiet. To a man like Elias, it felt like a mirror. You could ride for days out there and never find another heartbeat but your own. He stopped near the ridge, wiped the back of his hand across his brow, and looked toward the far end of his property. Beyond the old corral, two weathered crosses leaned in the sand. The boards had warped in the sun, the names almost faded. He didn't have to read them anymore. They were carved into him, not wood. Clara Monroe, Abigail Monroe, his wife and daughter. The wind stirred then, lifting the hem of his duster coat. He closed his eyes and let it pass through him. The smell of sagebrush and dust filled his lungs, familiar and hollow. It had been 8 years since the fever took them both, and still, every evening at sunset, he found himself looking toward those graves like a man waiting for forgiveness that would never come. Elias turned the horse toward home. The sun was bleeding into the horizon now, thick orange spilling across the land. Shadows grew long. The silence deepened. He reached the barn just as the first stars began to pierce the sky. The day was done, but his mind never truly rested. He unsaddled the horse, ran a brush down its flank, and listened to the cicadas start their chorus. Their shrill hum filled the emptiness, yet somehow it made him feel more alone. Inside the cabin, the lamplight flickered weakly. Dust motes drifted in the glow, dancing like tiny spirits in the air. On the mantel above the cold hearth sat a single photograph. Clara, in her wedding dress, holding baby Abby, both smiling at something just beyond the frame. Elias touched the glass with a calloused thumb. The silence pressed close again, familiar as breath. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, sat by the table, and stared at the wall until the liquid burned its way down. Another day gone. Another day that felt the same as the last. In town, people talked about ghosts to fill the silence. Stories gave shape to things they feared. Elias had never been one for such nonsense, but even he'd heard the whispers at the saloon when he rode in for supplies. They said a woman haunted the desert, appearing at dusk to the lost, leading them out of sandstorms and vanishing without a trace. Some said she was a spirit. Others swore she was flesh and blood, a thief wearing a veil to hide her face. They called her the Desert Ghost. Elias had laughed it off with the rest of them, but that name, it lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Maybe because ghosts, he thought, came in more than one kind. When the bottle was half empty and the stars were high, he blew out the lamp and stepped out onto the porch. The night had cooled, the desert stretching before him like a black ocean under silver moonlight. Crickets chirped from the brush. A lone coyote howled far off. Then, something strange. From the north edge of his land, near the dry wash, came the faint sound of hooves. Slow, unsteady. He straightened, listening. Another sound followed. A low groan, the kind a horse makes when it's spent past saving. He grabbed his lantern from the post, lit it quick, and started walking. The glow cut a narrow path through the dark, flickering over rock and sage. The closer he got, the clearer the noise became. Labored breathing, the dull thud of a body shifting against sand. And then he saw it. A horse lay half buried at the edge of the wash, sides heaving, foam at its mouth. Beside it, a figure. Small, slumped, motionless. Elias's boots sank into the soft sand as he crouched beside the shape. The lantern's light caught fabric, torn, dust-stained, wrapped tight around a woman's body. A thin veil hid her face, the kind desert travelers wore against the wind. Her skin beneath it was pale under the grime. "Ma'am?" His voice came rough. No answer. He touched her shoulder. Her body was cold but not gone. A faint tremor shivered through her when he shook her gently. She stirred, whispering something he couldn't catch. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe. I got you." He looked around. The desert stretched endless, no sign of another soul. Whoever she was, she'd been out there a long time. With effort, he lifted her into his arms. She was light as smoke. The horse beside them gave a final sigh and went still. He glanced at it once, hat tipping low. Then he started back toward the cabin, the lantern swaying in his other hand. The walk felt longer than usual. The night air bit at his skin, and sand crunched under his boots. The woman's head rested against his chest, breath shallow but steady. Beneath the veil, he could feel warmth against him, a reminder that she was alive, fragile but real. At the cabin, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her to the bed. The lamplight threw long shadows across the room. He set her down carefully, brushing sand from her hair. She didn't stir. Her clothes were travel-worn, faded canvas, the edges burned from the sun. Her hands were scarred, palms rough like someone who'd lived by work, not comfort. Around her neck hung a small pendant of silver, engraved with lines that looked almost tribal, Apache markings maybe, though he wasn't sure. Elias filled a bowl with water, dampened a cloth, and cleaned the dust from her face. She was younger than he expected, no more than 30, maybe less, but her expression carried years he recognized, the kind that only came from surviving too much. When he reached for the veil, hesitation caught him. He told himself it was just to make sure she could breathe. Still, when he lifted the edge of the cloth and the lamplight touched her skin, he froze. Her face was beautiful, striking even, but marred by faint scars along her jaw and temple, like claw marks faded with time. Not enough to ruin her, only to make her seem unreal, like something half-born from the desert itself. He lowered the veil back over her. Whatever story she carried, it wasn't his to pry from her now. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls of the cabin with a low whistle. Elias sat in the chair beside the bed, eyes never leaving her. Every breath she took seemed fragile, as if the night might claim it. Hours passed. The lantern guttered low. He fought sleep until it became useless, then let his head rest against the wall. When he woke, the moon had shifted higher. The cabin glowed dim blue through the window. For a second, he thought the sound that woke him was the wind again, until he heard her voice. It was a whisper, faint but sharp. "Where am I?" Elias blinked, leaned forward. Her eyes were open now, wide, glassy, and filled with something between terror and confusion. "You're at my ranch," he said quietly. "You were out cold by the wash. I brought you in." Her gaze darted around the room, then back to him. "You shouldn't have." Her voice cracked, dry, trembling. "Maybe not," he said, keeping his tone even. "But I couldn't leave you out there." She tried to sit up, but the effort sent a shiver through her whole body. He pressed a hand gently to her shoulder. "Rest. You need water." Her breathing steadied, but her eyes stayed fixed on him, searching, wary. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the soft creak of the house filled the silence. Finally, her eyelids fluttered. She exhaled slow, as if surrendering to exhaustion, and the world went quiet again. Elias sat back in the chair, lantern light flickering across his face. He looked at her one more time. The mysterious woman who'd stumbled out of the desert like a story come to life, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. A stirring. A pull. He couldn't name it, not yet, but it was enough to keep him from closing his eyes again for the rest of the night. Outside, the desert wind whispered over the sand, carrying secrets too old for men to understand. And somewhere far out there, beyond the reach of light, the legends of the desert ghost began to shift, because she was no longer alone. Morning bled softly through the cabin window, painting the wooden floor in pale stripes of gold. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of sand and rain that never came. Elias Monroe had not slept much. He sat at the table, turning the cold cup of coffee in his hands, listening to the faint breathing from the bed behind him. Every few minutes, he looked over his shoulder to make sure she was still there, and not some trick of the desert night. The woman stirred when the first rays touched her face. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes trembling like shadows on her cheeks. Elias stood and poured water into a tin cup. She tried to sit up, failed, then turned her head toward him. Her voice was rough and small. "Where is this?" "My ranch," he said quietly. "You passed out by the wash. I brought you in." She looked at him, unsure whether to thank him or run. Her eyes were dark, sharp, and frightened. She reached for the pendant at her throat, closing her fingers around it as though it were the only thing holding her together. "You're safe here," Elias added. "No one will bother you." Her lips parted, but no answer came. She sipped the water he offered, each swallow slow, deliberate, like she was reminding herself she was still alive. When she was done, she pushed the cup back and looked toward the door. The desert wind whispered beyond the wood, carrying the dry hiss of sand against glass. "Horse didn't make it," Elias said. "I buried it before sunup." A flicker crossed her face. Pain, gratitude, maybe both. She nodded once and lay back down, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He left her to rest and stepped outside. The light hit him full in the face. The day had already begun to warm, and the sky stretched endless and cruelly blue. He went about his chores, hauling water from the well, feeding the cattle, checking the fence, but his mind stayed with the stranger in his bed. It had been years since another human voice filled that house. Even the silence seemed different now. Less like a wound, more like a pause. By noon, she was standing in the doorway, leaning on the frame for balance. The veil still covered her face. Elias looked up from the trough, surprised. "You shouldn't be on your feet yet," he said. "I can't lie still," she answered. Her voice was steadier now. "I need to keep moving." "Moving where? You don't even have a horse." "I'll walk." He studied her. The desert would eat her alive if she tried. "You won't make it a mile in that sun." She straightened, stubborn. "Then I'll make it half." He wiped his hands on his jeans, then pointed toward the bench by the corral. "Sit. Eat first. Then we'll talk about half." She hesitated, then obeyed. He brought her a plate of bread and dried meat. She ate in silence, small bites, eyes never leaving the horizon. When she finally spoke again, her tone was softer. "You live alone?" "Been that way a while." "Why?" He shrugged. "Some people leave. Some don't get the choice." The question lingered. She didn't press. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and mesquite. He watched her as she lifted the veil slightly to eat, just enough to reveal the curve of her lips, a small scar at the corner. Sunlight caught the silver of her pendant. Something about it seemed old, older than the land itself. When the heat grew unbearable, they retreated inside. She asked for cloth and water to wash. Elias brought them, then turned his back, giving her space. When she finished, she said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." He paused. "How do you know my name?" "It's on the saddle by the door." He glanced over. The leather still bore the faded stamp, Monroe Ranch. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Guess it is." She studied him a long moment. "You shouldn't have helped me," she said again. "Men who do usually regret it." "Maybe," he said, meeting her eyes. "But I've regretted worse." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, the kind that never brings rain, just noise and memory. Elias looked through the window. "Storm coming from the east," he murmured. "Better stay put till it passes." She nodded. "I won't cause trouble." He almost laughed. "Lady, trouble's been scarce around here. Might do me good to see what it looks like again." That night, the storm arrived. Wind howled across the plain, rattling shutters and driving sand through the cracks. Elias lit a lantern and checked the doors while she sat near the hearth, the light flickering over her veil. Each gust made her flinch. He saw it, the way her hands trembled, how she pressed the pendant to her chest like a prayer. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but the lie was thin. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her, and took the chair opposite. The cabin felt small against the storm's roar. "Wind spooks you?" he said. "Not the wind," she whispered. "The sound." He waited. "It sounds like them." she added. Voices in the dust. I used to think the desert was empty. It isn't. Elias didn't press for names. He'd learned that people carried ghosts better when you didn't force them to speak. They sat in silence until the wind began to ease, and she finally lifted her veil away from her face. The gesture was slow, deliberate. Her skin was pale under the lamplight, her scars faint but unmistakable. Yet her eyes, dark, steady, alive, held him still. He didn't speak, didn't stare. He only nodded once, as if to say, I see you. That's enough. Her lips parted, a small breath escaping. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to do. I should sleep, she said finally, standing. Elias nodded again. You take the bed. I'll keep the chair. The rain never came, only wind and silence. She lay down, back to him, veil resting on the nightstand beside the lantern. He watched the shadows shift across the walls until sleep pulled at him. When dawn came, the bed was empty, the blanket folded neatly, the pendant gone. He stepped outside, calling once into the still air. No answer, only the desert stretching endless, unbroken. Her footprints led toward the ridge, then vanished in the sand. He found the note an hour later, tucked under his coffee cup on the table. The handwriting was rough, letters pressed deep into the paper. Thank you for the kindness. Forget me. He stood there a long while, the words heavy in his hand. The sun was climbing, already harsh, turning everything gold and merciless. He stepped onto the porch, looking out toward the horizon where her trail disappeared. For the first time in years, something inside him moved. Not pain, not peace, but a question he couldn't ignore. Who was she? The wind carried the faint scent of sage again, same as the day before, but different somehow. Sharper, alive. He took his hat from the peg and settled it on his head. Forget you, he murmured. Not likely. He mounted his horse, turned toward town, and rode out into the burning light, unaware that the legend of the desert ghost was about to change forever. The town of San Diablo always woke slow, like an old dog rising from the dust. Morning light crawled through the crooked windows of the saloon, lighting smoke, sawdust, and faces that had forgotten what peace looked like. Elias Monroe stepped inside just as the piano fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned his way. Cowhands, drifters, the sheriff behind his whiskey. He hadn't been here in months. Not since he decided the sound of laughter only made his house feel emptier. He ordered coffee instead of whiskey. The barkeep, a thin man with a scar down his chin, eyed him curiously. Morning, Elias. Didn't expect to see you ride in this early. Elias nodded. Just needed some supplies. Feed. Lamp oil. The man poured the coffee slow, his eyes flicking toward the group by the notice board. A couple of strangers stood there, their coats too fine, their spurs too clean. They were posting something new, a paper that fluttered when the door swung. Elias caught the glimpse of a woman's face drawn in charcoal lines beneath bold letters. Wanted. Alive. He moved closer, heart tightening. The sketch was rough, but the eyes. Those eyes he couldn't mistake. The veil was gone, but the scars were there. Beneath it read, Mara Holt, fugitive, treason, theft, and aiding enemies of the United States Army. Reward, $500. Elias stared long enough for the room to go quiet. The taller of the two strangers noticed him. Something the matter, friend? Elias shook his head once. Just looks familiar, that's all. The man smiled thinly. Then maybe you can help. She's been spotted near these parts. Calls herself the Desert Ghost. Been stealing army supplies, freeing prisoners, stirring up trouble. Pretty little menace from what I hear. Elias kept his voice calm. You sure that's all she's been doing? Sure enough, the man replied. You seen her? Elias took a long sip of coffee before answering. Can't say that I have. The man studied him a moment, suspicion flickering, then turned away. If you do, friend, you send word to the sheriff. Army's paying good money. Elias nodded slowly, but his hands trembled around the cup. He finished the coffee in silence, dropped a coin on the counter, and walked out into the morning heat. The air smelled like dust and iron. His boots felt heavy. He saddled his horse and headed north, the road winding between dry hills. His mind wouldn't quiet. The woman, the one who called herself Nothing, who left his house before sunrise, was now a fugitive worth half a year's wages. But the stories didn't fit. She wasn't a thief. She was running from something worse. By noon, he found himself near the edge of the canyon, where the land opened wide and empty. That was when he saw the smoke, a thin column rising from the distance, too controlled to be a wildfire. He followed it, careful and slow, until the ground leveled out into a hollow. There, hidden behind boulders, stood an old stone chapel half buried in sand. The roof had caved, but the walls still stood like bones. Smoke rose from a small fire outside, and near it, her. Mara knelt beside the flames, feeding twigs into the pit. She didn't look surprised when he rode in, just tired. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "Didn't plan to," he answered. "Town's talking about you." She poked the fire, sending sparks into the air. "They've been talking about me for years. They've got posters. Said your name's Mara Holt." Her hand froze. For a long time she didn't speak. Then, quietly, "So they still remember that name. You're wanted for treason." A faint smile touched her lips, bitter as desert rain. "They would call it that." He dismounted, walked closer. The chapel loomed behind her, the cross half fallen against the wall. "You gonna tell me what really happened?" She looked up at him. The sunlight caught her face, turning the scars to silver. "If I do, you won't believe it. Try me." She studied him for a long time, as if weighing the worth of truth. Then she stood, brushed the sand from her skirt, and walked toward the chapel door. "Come inside," she said. Inside, the air was cool and dry, thick with the smell of old stone and ashes. She lit another lantern from the fire and set it on the altar. The flame danced across the walls, revealing shelves of supplies, bandages, canteens, bundles of food. "This is where I come between storms," she said. "The desert forgets, but I can't." He watched as she unwrapped a bundle near the altar. Inside were small toys, carved from wood. Horses, a doll missing an arm. "I wasn't always a ghost," she said. "Once, I was a wife, married to a man named Captain Holt. He served the army near the border. A proud man, cold. Thought the world bent under his boots." She paused, voice growing thin. "He led a campaign against an Apache settlement. Said they were rebels, but it wasn't war. It was slaughter. I saw it happen. I heard the screaming. He burned their camp to ash." She picked up the small doll, turning it in her hands. "There was a woman there, dying. She pushed her child into my arms before the fire took her. I ran. My husband called it betrayal. The army called it desertion." Her gaze lifted to him. "I called it mercy." Elias said nothing. The lantern crackled, throwing shadows like ghosts on the wall. "I've been running ever since," she said. "That child's safe now, hidden where the army won't look. But they still hunt me. They can't stand that one of their own saw what they really are." She set the doll down and looked at him. "Now you know. If you ride back and tell them, they'll pay you more than you'll ever make fixing fences." He shook his head slowly. "I don't care about their money." "Then why come?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw what the desert had made of her. Not a spirit, not a thief, just a woman who'd lost everything and still kept going. "Because I needed to know if you were real," he said. "Turns out you are." For the first time, her expression softened. "Real isn't always good. Sometimes it's the only thing that's left." Outside, thunder rolled low. The horizon darkened with another storm building. Elias stepped to the doorway, scanning the distance. Dust plumes were rising to the east. Riders. 3, maybe 4. Moving fast. "You expecting company?" he asked. Her face went pale. "Bounty hunters." He grabbed the reins of his horse and led it behind the wall. "We can outrun them if we move now." She shook her head. "You don't understand. They don't stop. They'll follow the tracks all the way back to your ranch. I won't bring that on you." "Too late for that," he said. "They already saw me in town. You think they won't come asking questions?" For a moment she said nothing, the firelight trembling between them. Then she gave a short nod. "There's an old canyon path north of here, narrow, full of rock. They won't follow us through if the storm hits first." They saddled his horse together, her movements quick and sure. The wind picked up, carrying grit that stung their eyes. As they rode, the sky turned dark, the desert breathing dust. The storm was coming fast. Mara led the way through twisting ravines and dry stream beds. The air thickened with sand, turning the world into a blur of gold and gray. Behind them, distant shouts cut through the wind. Gunfire cracked once, faint but real. Elias felt the burn of adrenaline rise, the same instinct that had gone numb for years. They pushed harder. The canyon walls closed around them, swallowing sound, until only the rush of wind and their own hearts remained. By the time they reached the other side, the sky had gone almost black. Lightning flashed over the desert like veins of fire. The bounty hunters were nowhere in sight. They stopped at a rocky overhang and took shelter. Elias helped her dismount, and they crouched together beneath the stone, breathless, dust coating their faces. She turned to him, voice barely audible over the storm. "You should leave me here. If they catch us together, they'll kill you too." He met her gaze. "I've been dead inside for years, Mara. Might as well die doing something that matters." Her expression broke, the wall she'd built crumbling in a single look. "You're a fool." "Maybe, but I'm your fool now." A flash of lightning tore across the sky, and thunder answered a heartbeat later. The wind screamed through the rocks, shaking the ground beneath them. She leaned closer, half to steady herself, half to hear his voice. He smelled of smoke and rain that never fell. "After this," she said, "you'll wish you never found me." He smiled faintly. Too late for that, too. For a moment they stayed there, two souls caught between storm and silence. When the wind finally eased, she looked out over the desert, eyes shining. "There's a place west of here," she whispered. "An old church buried by sand. That's where I used to hide. It's safer than anywhere else." "Then that's where we'll go." She looked at him again, and this time she didn't argue. As they rode out beneath the fading storm, the moon broke through the clouds, silver light glinting off her pendant. Elias glanced at it, realizing the markings weren't random. They were letters, Apache script, a word he didn't understand. Maybe a name, maybe a promise. He didn't ask. Some truths had to wait. By the time the desert fell quiet again, they were miles from the canyon. The church loomed ahead, its steeple half buried, the cross crooked against the sky. Mara stopped her horse and turned to him. "This is where it ends," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, this is where it begins." And somewhere beyond that silence, thunder rolled again. Not from the sky this time, but from the hearts of two people who had finally found what they didn't know they were looking for. The night came heavy with dust and warning. Clouds rolled across the desert sky, bruised and restless, carrying a wind that sang through the dunes like a cry from the dead. Elias Monroe and Mara Holt rode in silence, the rhythm of hooves blending with the low rumble of thunder far to the west. The old church stood ahead, half swallowed by sand, its broken steeple jutting from the earth like a bone. When they reached it, Mara slid from her saddle first, her movements weary but sure. She ran a hand over the splintered door and pushed it open. The hinges gave a long, tired groan. Inside, the air was cool, shadowed and filled with the faint scent of old wood and dust. Elias followed her in, shutting the door against the rising wind. His lantern threw gold light over the cracked pews and the crumbling altar. The walls bore faded symbols, crosses, prayers, marks of faith long abandoned. He could hear the desert outside beginning to roar. Mara moved to the back of the church, setting her pack on a table warped with age. "We'll wait out the storm here," she said. "No one will find us till morning." He nodded, tying his horse near a window where the beast could breathe the cooler air. Then he joined her, setting his rifle down. The lantern's flame flickered between them, casting soft light across her face. She looked different now, tired, dust-streaked, but calmer somehow. "You've been here before," he said quietly. She glanced around the room, eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the wall. "Many times. When I needed to disappear, you built this hideout." "Not built," she corrected. "Reclaimed. It was already dying. I just gave it a reason to stand a little longer." He smiled faintly. "Sounds a lot like you." Her eyes met his for a heartbeat, then turned away. "Don't start thinking I'm something worth saving, Elias. I'm not. I'll decide that for myself." Outside, the wind screamed louder, slamming sand against the walls. The church shook, but held. Lightning flashed through the windows, painting their faces in white fire. For a while, neither spoke. He could hear her breathing, steady but shallow. Finally, she broke the silence. "You think I deserve all those posters?" He took a long moment before answering. "I think the world needs monsters to make sense of its sins. They call you one because it's easier than facing their own." Her jaw tightened. "You talk like a preacher." He let out a breath that could have been a laugh. "Maybe I just talk like a man who's lost enough to stop judging others." She studied him from across the table, eyes softening. "What did you lose, Elias?" He looked toward the flickering lantern. "A wife. A daughter. Fever took 'em. I buried them out by the ridge. Thought I'd buried myself with them, too." Mara said nothing, only listened. "I stopped talking to folks," he continued. "Stopped laughing. The land got quiet, and I let it be. Till you showed up." She lowered her gaze. "That wasn't supposed to happen. You weren't supposed to find me." "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe that's what saving looks like. Two people lost enough to meet in the middle." The storm roared harder, shaking the rafters. The lantern flickered again, shadows dancing wild across the walls. Mara stood and crossed to the small window, watching the lightning split the horizon. "They'll come for us when it clears," she murmured. "They always do." "Let them," Elias said, rising. "They'll find two people ready for them this time." She turned to face him. "You'd die for me." He didn't hesitate. "If it came to that." Her expression broke. Part anger, part disbelief. "Don't be a fool. You don't even know who I really am." He stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the wood. "I know enough. I know you've been running from men who should have protected you. I know you saved lives when others took them. I know you're not the ghost they say you are." She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. "You think kindness erases blood? You think love redeems the damned? I think love's the only thing that ever has." The words hung there, trembling in the air like the lantern flame. She stared at him, lips parted but silent. Then lightning flashed again, and the whole world shuddered. The thunder followed close behind, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Without a word, Mara turned away, crossing to the corner where she'd laid her bedroll. "We should rest," she said softly. "Morning will come fast." Elias didn't argue. He stoked the lantern lower, then sat near the wall, rifle within reach. For a while, he listened to the storm beat against the church, steady as a drum. But beneath that, he could hear her breathing, slow, uneven, like a woman holding back a lifetime of noise. After a long silence, she spoke again, voice trembling in the dark. "I killed him." Elias looked up. "Who?" "My husband," she said. "Captain Holt. I shot him the night I ran. He tried to take the child from me, to finish what he started in that camp. I didn't think. I just pulled the trigger. He fell into the fire." The confession broke something in her voice. She pressed a hand to her mouth, but the words kept coming. "Every night I see his face. Every time I hear thunder, I think it's him coming for me. That's why I run. That's why I hide. Because I don't know if I was saving that child or just killing a piece of myself." Elias rose slowly, crossing to her side. She didn't look up until he knelt in front of her. He took her trembling hands in his. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. "If you hadn't, you'd be dead. That child would be dead. You call it murder. I call it mercy." Tears streaked her dust-stained cheeks. "You don't understand. I can't wash it off." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to. You just have to live through it." She looked at him then, eyes wide and breaking. The storm howled around them, but inside the church, the world seemed to pause. He leaned closer without thinking, and she didn't move away. When his lips met hers, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Years of silence colliding all at once. Her hands clutched his coat, pulling him closer before she finally pushed back, breath shaking. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." He froze. "I'm sorry." She turned her face away. "You'll die if you stay with me. Everyone who tries does." He exhaled, long and steady. "Then I guess I'll be the first who doesn't." Outside, a gunshot split the night. Then another. Elias grabbed his rifle, moving to the door. Through the window, faint shapes flickered in the lightning. Riders approaching fast, their lanterns cutting through the storm. "They found us," Mara said, voice tight. He checked the chamber. "Stay low." The wind screamed as bullets shattered the stained glass above the altar. Elias fired back through the window, the rifle's thunder lost beneath the storm. Sand and smoke filled the air. Mara crawled to the other side of the door, grabbed a spare pistol, and fired 2 quick shots into the dark. A cry rang out, then silence. "They're circling?" Elias muttered. "We've got maybe a minute before they rush in." Mara's hands shook as she reloaded. "There's no way out. The back door's buried." Elias looked around, brain racing. "Then we make our stand here." She met his eyes. "You don't have to do this." "I know." The door burst inward before she could answer. 3 men stormed in, their coats soaked, guns drawn. Lightning flashed behind them, turning them into shadows. Elias fired once. 1 fell. Another shot cracked from Mara's pistol. The second man dropped with a scream. The last lunged forward, tackling Elias into a pew. They hit the ground hard, the rifle spinning away. Elias struggled, the man's hand closing around his throat. He felt the strength fading, the storm roaring in his ears. Then a gunshot exploded beside him. The weight fell limp. Mara stood over them, pistol smoking, her face streaked with tears and rain. Elias coughed, sitting up. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "You?" He glanced at the body, then at her. "Better than him?" The wind began to die down. The silence that followed was thick and unreal. Mara dropped the gun, sank to her knees beside him, and covered her face. He pulled her close without thinking, wrapping his arms around her as the first faint light of dawn broke through the clouds. Neither spoke. The storm had passed, but something in them had shifted, something raw and real that couldn't be undone. Hours later, when the sun rose over the dunes, the world looked clean again, washed of dust and blood. The bodies lay outside, half buried in sand. Elias and Mara sat on the steps of the church, watching the horizon turn gold. "They'll send more," she said quietly. "They always do." "Then we'll keep moving," he replied. "Find somewhere they don't care who we were." She looked at him, eyes softer than the dawn. "You'd give up everything for me?" He smiled faintly. Wasn't much left to give. For the first time, she laughed. Small, broken, but real. The sound filled the empty desert, bright and human. She leaned against his shoulder, her fingers brushing his hand. "I never believed in salvation," she whispered, "but maybe it finds you anyway." He turned his head slightly. "Maybe it does." They sat like that, until the heat returned, until the sand shimmered again and the world felt alive. Behind them, the church stood silent, half ruined but still standing, like 2 souls who'd forgotten how to fall. The days that followed the storm were quiet ones, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath after a long cry. The desert had changed color, washed clean by the wind, softer now under the sun. From the door of the old church, Elias Monroe watched the light spread across the dunes and thought it looked like forgiveness. He and Mara buried the dead together. No words, no prayers, just the scrape of shovels and the hiss of shifting sand. When it was done, they stood side by side in the rising heat. The graves were marked with nothing but stones. The desert would take them soon enough, and maybe that was right. Some men didn't need names anymore. Mara wiped her brow with a trembling hand. Her hair clung to her face and her voice came low. "It never ends, does it?" Elias shook his head. "No, but maybe it slows down when you stop running." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes unreadable. "You think that's what this is? Stopping?" "It's the closest thing I've got to peace," he said. They left the church behind that afternoon. Elias didn't look back, but he could feel it watching them. The last witness to what they had become. The road ahead stretched empty. No riders, no smoke, no signs of pursuit. Only the wide breadth of the world, open and waiting. By the third day, they reached his ranch. The land looked different than when he'd left it, like the desert had decided to give it another chance. The fences still leaned, the corral still sagged, but the air carried the faint smell of rain. When Mara saw the two small crosses behind the barn, she stopped walking. "These are them," she said softly. Elias nodded. "Clara and Abigail." She knelt, brushing sand from the names carved into the wood. "They'd be proud, you know." He let out a breath that felt like it had been stuck in his chest for years. "Of what?" "That you kept living," she said, standing, "even when you didn't want to." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The wind moved through the dry grass like an old song, and for the first time in 8 years, he didn't hate the sound. Mara stayed. At first, she said it was only for a few nights, long enough to rest, long enough to see if the hunters had truly stopped. But the nights stretched into weeks, and the fear that used to live behind her eyes began to fade. She slept without her pistol nearby, laughed once or twice, even hummed while she worked. Elias found himself listening for that sound more than he wanted to admit. They repaired the fences together, fixed the well pump, cleared the debris left by the last dust storm. Each day brought small things back to life. Patches of green among the brush, a newborn calf bleeding weakly, the sound of water trickling from the well. It was as if the land had decided to forgive them too. One evening, while the sun burned low and red, Elias found her sitting on the porch with the pendant in her hand. The silver had dulled from years of wear, but the carved letters still caught the light. He sat beside her without speaking. "You ever figure out what it says?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "It's Apache. It means return. The woman who gave me her child pressed it into my palm, said it would lead me back when the time was right. And did it?" Her eyes softened. "Maybe, but not to where I thought. I thought it meant I'd find home again. I didn't realize home could look like this." Elias smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes creasing. "You think this is home?" She looked out over the land, the hills, the sky, the graves. "It's something close. I think that's enough." He wanted to say more, but the moment was too still to break. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. That night, the stars came out clearer than he'd ever seen. The desert was black and silver, alive with the quiet hum of life. They sat outside long after the lantern went out, listening to the night breathe. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than the wind. "You could have turned me in, got paid, walked away." "I didn't want money," he said. "Didn't want to walk away." "Then what did you want?" He looked at her, the moonlight washing the years from her face. "To stop feeling like a ghost." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead against his, and whispered, "Then maybe we both came back from the dead." In the months that followed, people in town started talking again. They said the desert ghost had vanished for good. Some claimed she'd drowned in the flood that hit the southern pass. Others swore they'd seen her spirit riding under a full moon, leading lost travelers toward the mountains. But Elias knew better. He never corrected them. Some legends deserved to fade on their own. Life settled into a rhythm. Mara tended the garden that refused to grow before. She learned the ranch's stubborn ways, the pump that needed coaxing, the mare that only she could calm. Elias caught himself laughing again, not because of any joke, but because it felt good to remember how. One morning, while mending a fence, he heard her call his name. The sound came sharp and urgent. He dropped his hammer and ran toward the house. She stood by the gate, her hands shaking, eyes fixed on the horizon. "What is it?" he asked. "Riders!" she said. 3 of them. He felt his chest tighten. Could be traitors or not. He looked. The figures were distant, just specks moving through heat and dust. Then one of them raised a hand. A gesture of greeting, not threat. When they drew closer, Elias recognized the sheriff's old horse and exhaled. The sheriff dismounted, tipping his hat. "Morning, Monroe." "Morning," Elias said carefully. "Something wrong?" The man glanced at Mara, who stood half-hidden behind the gatepost. "Got word from Tucson. Those bounty boys who went missing in the storm, they found what was left of them. Army's closing the case. Seems your ghost story finally put itself to rest." Elias nodded slowly. "That's so? That's so." The sheriff looked at Mara again, then back at him. "You've had a quiet life out here. Keep it that way." He turned his horse and rode off without another word. Mara watched them go, her body still rigid, until the dust swallowed them. Then she turned to Elias. "They're letting it go. Looks like it." She stepped closer, voice breaking into something like a laugh. "I don't know what to do now." He smiled. "Then start with staying." And she did. The seasons turned. The land softened. Rain came one night, real rain that soaked the soil and filled the cracks. Mara ran out into it, arms open, laughing like a child. Elias watched from the porch, the lantern behind him flickering gold. When she turned, hair plastered to her face, he saw a woman reborn. The ghost was gone. All that remained was her. Months later, they built a small schoolhouse near the ridge. Children from neighboring settlements came. Orphans, wanderers, half-blooded kids no one else would take. Mara taught them letters and songs. Elias built desks from old barnwood. The sound of laughter returned to the land that once knew only silence. Sometimes, at dusk, he'd catch her standing by the graves behind the barn, the setting sun painting her in gold. She'd whisper something he couldn't hear, then walk back with a small smile. He never asked what she said. Some prayers weren't meant to be shared. One evening as they sat on the porch, Mara looked up at the stars. "Do you ever wonder if they're watching us? The ones we lost?" Elias took her hand. "If they are, I hope they see we're trying." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You think this lasts? Peace?" He exhaled slow. "Maybe peace isn't something that lasts. Maybe it's just something you keep choosing. Every morning you wake up, you decide not to let the ghosts win." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then we'll keep choosing." The desert wind stirred again, soft this time, almost kind. In the distance, the dry riverbed shimmered under the moon. For the first time in years, tiny flowers had begun to bloom there, small, stubborn bursts of color against the endless sand. Elias rose, walked down the steps, and stood at the edge of the yard. The land stretched wide and alive before him. He turned back to the woman on the porch, the woman who'd once been a myth, a fugitive, a ghost, and saw her now for what she truly was. Human, free. Mara joined him, slipping her hand into his. Together they stood in the quiet, watching the horizon turn silver beneath the stars. The night didn't feel so large anymore. It felt like home. "Elias," she whispered, "do you still believe in miracles?" He looked at her, his smile slow and certain. "I do now." She laughed softly, the sound carrying over the sand. Then maybe the desert finally gave one back, and somewhere beyond the ranch, the wind carried a whisper that might have been just the sound of the earth cooling, or maybe something more, the echo of a legend finally laid to rest. The desert ghost was gone, and in her place stood a woman whose heart beat steady against the silence. The desert bloomed again that year. Small blossoms grew along the fences, stubborn and bright. Travelers who passed by said the land felt different there, as if the earth itself remembered kindness. Some even swore they saw a woman in white at dusk, walking beside a tall rancher, their hands intertwined. But those were just stories. What was true was simpler. 2 souls who had been lost too long had finally found each other. And in a world built on dust and sorrow, that was enough. In the heart of a land carved by dust, where loneliness once ruled every sunrise, two souls proved that even the most haunted hearts can find home again. Elias Monroe and Mara Holt, once ghost and wanderer, became the proof that love can bloom in the harshest deserts, that peace is not found by running from the past, but by facing it hand in hand. When the storms fade and silence returns, what remains is not the legend of the desert ghost, but the simple truth that love, real love, never dies. It just waits, like the desert, for the right rain to fall. If stories like this touch your heart, if you believe that even in the wildest corners of the West, love still finds a way, then subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles. Don't miss the next tale of passion, redemption, and timeless romance beneath the burning western sky. Every legend begins with a heartbeat. Make sure you're there to hear the next one.